Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our CACNY and CAN meeting together, learning about financial aid. I am so happy to be in this room to learn more about FAFSA. But let's give folks like 2 more minutes to just finish joining in. We've got a number of people still in the waiting room, and then we'll get started. I'm going to put our agenda in the chat as well as our objectives just for your reference. Every time I'm in one of these meetings, I wish I had a playlist. And then as soon as I leave, I forget about it. But hear me this time. The next time you see me, I will have a playlist. And I don't know what will be the theme of it. Because for this, there's got to be like a special FAFSA playlist that's got certain songs. But like in the future, for just like a general, just like post-secondary access playlist, I just need it. I know CACNY's worked at that. Maybe that could be another collaboration. I'd love to have some music playing right now instead of just staring at my screen.
I do
Just
think
imagine.
Spotify has a playlist.
Is it called financial aid playlist?
I think it might have been more related to FAFSA simplification. So it
The,
may
the
not be
FAFSA
the most,
Blues, I think it
yeah,
was called.
it may not be the most uplifting.
Oh no, no,
But
I don't want
just
that.
throwing that out there that you might
I'm
find
sort of
something.
thinking like Motown and like Happy Beats and all this kind of thing. So let's see what we come up with. It'll be great next time. It will happen. It will happen. All right, all right. Well, I'm having a good old time because anytime that we're talking FAFSA is a good old time. Not because we love the FAFSA, but rather because we love helping people fill it out and get their money so they can go to school and get their education. That's why it's so important to get together every so often and talk about financial aid. That's for me, that's like the ticket. You just got to gather up all the information, digest it, and help people with the information. That is why we are here today. That's why we've got Robert Wienerman talking to us with his particular, like very detailed perspective. And that's why we joined up with CACNY, hoping to spread that information to more and more people. Before I turn it over, I gotta say, I'm here with much excitement. I also wanna just call out my partner in FAFSA crime, Kim Nauer. She's here chiming in with her knowledge and wisdom, and she and I will be monitoring the chat for questions and comments that we'll elevate every so often. And a number of my colleagues from New Visions are here too, and they'll be helping elevate questions too. It'll be great. Your questions will be heard, and then we'll have an awesome chat like FAQ, right? All right, so that's one thing. The other thing is make sure to change your name to your actual name and your organization or school. That will help us so much later on as we take attendance and count up numbers. I don't care, right? Like I want all of us to be here, 500 people, 200 people, 10, it doesn't matter, but you know our funders care. So please help us help ourselves to get money by putting your name correctly in your little window. That would be great. And we've put the objectives in the chat. Later on, we're going to do an evaluation through poll. And one of the questions is going to be, did we meet our objective? objectives, and then if you read the objectives, then you will know if we met them, and you can answer in an informed way. All right, I think that's all I have to say. I am so happy to be here and so happy to turn this over right now to Robert Wienerman. Take it away.
Thank you, Sandy, and welcome everyone. Thrilled to be here again and have the opportunity to talk to you about what has been very challenging and what I'm optimistic will be less challenging going forward, but we'll still be facing some challenges. I do want to also thank my both personal and professional friend, Myra Vasquez from Virginia Peninsula Community College, who I asked to join us to share her perspective from the office, and Walter Velez, who I don't know personally. I know of, but I don't know personally, who's also a financial aid officer from the CUNY system, right? And to share his perspective. So before we started open the webinar, the group of us decided that rather than me doing, a formal presentation that can't be interrupted, everybody has been invited. Everybody on the panel has been invited to pipe in with their experiences, and I may pause and ask for their experiences. But kind of to get us going, I thought it would be helpful to look at just some facts and some things that we know. From my perspective, who is someone who does training for financial aid officers, some of the things that I was both most surprised by, things that happened after our December program last year. For those of you who were there was, things changed for months after that. So there was that, and also what we do know about 25-26. And so I'm going to start with some real basics. I don't know if everyone in the group, everyone participating, has a trail of experience that would allow you to skip the first couple of slides. But I do want to make sure that everybody knew a couple of things about financial aid that are very impactful for an applicant. And I wanted to kind of define first two things that financial aid administrators are required to do when they receive an application. They're very different, but they are both things that can create additional work for the applicant and their contributors. And the first of those is something called verification. And I always like to use verification with a capital V, because verification is a defined term that the Department of Education uses. And basically, verification is simply a process by which the Department of Education defines that the school is required to check a certain set of data that's going into the application using the school's expected documentation. So if a student is selected for verification, the department is usually the selector, but the school can also select them. Then the school is on notice that before they can do anything to process that application, they need to collect specific documentation that the department defines to check specific answers in the FAFSA. And for most people in a traditional year, that's going to be a request for a signed copy of the tax return, because the data that will be reviewed are specific tax data. But there's another kind of verification called identity verification, where the department has asked the institutions, the schools, to make sure the person applying for financial aid is a real person who intends to enroll in the school. And so that's, we really have an income verification process, and we have a identity verification process. And sometimes the department can choose both for the same student. And so if the student is informed that they are selected for verification, it usually means the department told the school to check their application. Now, separate from verification is something called a conflicting information review. And every school is required to make sure that the information in the FAFSA is consistent with other information they know about the student. And this is not something the department generally chooses, but the department has to find certain things for the schools that are always conflicting information. But sometimes the school has to reach out to an applicant and ask for additional information because maybe the admissions application said one thing and the financial aid application said the other thing, and both of them can't be correct. And so before the school can move forward with processing, they need to get some confirmation on that. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the big conflicting information issues that have come up in the FAFSA simplification world. But a lot of times, a student will experience a request for information as kind of a challenge to their honesty or their eligibility. And it's always a good idea to remember that mistakes happen. Data gets input wrong. People put cents on the FAFSA instead of dollars on the FAFSA. And the school, if the school identifies these things, they need to pick that up. And if the department has identified that the school has to take action, the school doesn't have an out there. Now, there's other definitions I wanted to kind of throw out there because we may, as financial aid people, use some vernacular, and I wanted you to know what we're talking about. The original FAFSA obviously goes in with a certain set of data, but the school or the applicant can determine that a mistake was made, and either side, the applicant or the school, can make a correction. So a correction would simply be a change to the answer that was on the original FAFSA. So because either the applicant realized they'd made a mistake or the institution was correcting a mistake that was made. And the reason I'm highlighting that is that corrections in the FAFSA simplification world have been challenging. And you may have students who simply couldn't get them through. There are still a couple of corrections that schools have been having trouble making that the department kind of hasn't resolved yet. But also, there may have been instances where your student was getting an update and then another update and another update because the school was trying to get a transaction through, submitting data back to the FAFSA processing system at the department level, and either the correction didn't stick or the correction triggered another error in the application that needed to happen. And it can be very baffling, I think, if a student is receiving 5, 6, 7 updates of their application, one every day, perhaps without explanation. And so that's just one of the things that could be going on. Another complication in the FAFSA simplification world since 24-25 is something called federal tax information. The experience of most people who contributed to an application and have a social security number was that the IRS put data directly into the FAFSA. And that actually creates challenges at the institutional level, at the college level, because that data continues to be owned by the IRS, even though it's sitting in the Department of Education servers and it's at the school level. And that data has to be handled very gingerly, very carefully. And so schools have really been wrestling with how do we talk about that data? There's all sorts of permissions they need to get. Who on their campus can see it? The student might have had a relationship in the past with someone who was able to get access to the information, income information in the past, who no longer has access to that. So the student might have felt like there's a new bureaucratic layer in there. So whenever we say something like federal tax information or FTI, it's this new highly protected set of data that now exists in the applications for people that the schools are still trying to get their mind around how they can use it and communicate about it, things like that. Last two terms are the ICER. While people who are filing a FAFSA think of it as the FAFSA, once the schools get the data, they think of it as the ICER. The FAFSA data comes into the school's record system as an institutional student information record. And institutions, schools, financial aid officers talk about ICER data, not FAFSA data. And so when I say ICER data, or ICER, just think FAFSA that has been received by the school. And just because many of you may not have heard this, but there is this kind of meme that is going through the financial aid world called "I survived." Um, and you'll see it on mugs, and you'll see it on T-shirts, and you'll see it on banners, at the top of someone's website. So that's out there too. And then finally, the student aid index is the outcome, one of the outcomes of a submitted FAFSA. It's the value used to determine eligibility for all kinds of federal aid, state aid. Many schools use it for institutional aid. There's an alternative way that people may get Pell Grant, but the student aid index is kind of core to almost all financial aid awarding. So those are the terms we wanted you to be aware of. Now, I already mentioned that there's income verification and identity verification. This slide just shows you if the student is selected for one of the other, the kind of documentation that might need to be produced and sent in. If the student is selected for these things, it doesn't really mean to question their eligibility. Income verification is really used by the department to make sure that the way they're asking questions is accurate and they're getting accurate answers. It's really not that you're selected for income verification. More likely means that you answered a question with a value that the department wants to test the language on. It doesn't mean that they're suspecting that you did not answer that question correctly. And then identity verification is different though. If the student is selected for identity verification, there's some reason why the department might be concerned that the person might not be who they say they are. Now that reason could be negligible. The department's servers could say that there's a 0.05% chance that this is not an honest application. People are asked for identity verification. They should not worry that they're in trouble. It's only the student that will be asked for identity verification through the verification process. They're not looking at other members of the household. And it could be simply that historically someone with the student's name had attempted to commit fraud. And so now that that name is back in their system, they just want to check. And most people who are selected for identity verification come into the office with a valid government ID. School goes through a process, looks at the ID, looks at the person, makes a copy, and the issue is cleared. And as a taxpayer, I think it's good that the Department of Education does have filters in place to make sure that people aren't using the FAFSA to steal federal funds through the financial aid process. But again, these are not punitive. They may feel punitive because sometimes the school has to be really picky about the nature of the documentation that comes in. And that can be tense if that documentation has been sent 3 times and there's not been good communication about why you keep asking me for it. Like I remember back when I was at MIT, when we would ask for a tax return, our underlying assumption was someone would send us their federal tax return, but we would get a state tax return. And it took me a while to realize that the people that, this was in the old paper days, when people were mailing things in. So there was a time delay, but it took me a while to realize that the people who were getting the state tax returns just didn't do anything. They didn't go back and say, you sent me the wrong tax return. They just didn't say we got the federal tax return. And so next time we sent letters asking for information, they got the same thing. And so they sent it with a certification that we received it. And then they got another request. And it was only when it kind of escalated to me and I did investigated that I realized we've gotten the state tax return 3 times and never told the student we needed the federal tax return. Or maybe we got the 1040, but we needed the 1040 and other schedules, or maybe we didn't get adequate signatures. So just as a hint, if the student is kind of stuck in a loop like that, ask them to ask what was wrong with the document that was sent in, because that conversation is usually, I've sent this in 3 times, and the person looking at the record says, I don't think we've received it. And, you know, neither the person sending the information knew what they were specifically being asked, and the administrator didn't think to check what they had to see why it wasn't acceptable.
Robert,
Now,
real quick,
yeah.
and you can tell us that you're going to be getting to this later, because I know a lot of people on this call are going to be interested. When you say words like verification and identity, the first thing that hits our that we think about is what students with undocumented students and students with parents with social security numbers are going to be going through this coming season. But you'll be talking about that a bit later, right?
But we can talk about it now. I didn't prepare slides on it because I wanted that to be a little bit more of an open-ended discussion. But yeah, so right now I'm talking at the student level, and remember that with our students, the presumption is that they are eligible for federal financial aid as citizens or permanent residents or asylum seekers. And so when I talk about verification of income and verification of identity, well, let's start with identity. When I talk about verification of identity, we are focused on a student who presumably is eligible for Title IV aid and not at risk of inside or outside of the application process, not at risk as an undocumented person. When I talk about income verification may involve the verification of a contributor who may be an undocumented parent or an undocumented spouse for our independent students. And so we do want to acknowledge that it can be very scary to be interacting with, a federal agency. You're effectively, the Department of Education has asked the school on the department's behalf to check this data. And so, it's not a big jump to assume that you're interacting with the Department of Ed, and the Department of Ed is going to be privy to the information. And so there can be a lot of concern there. Now, having said that, FERPA, which is the primary privacy law governing the privacy of the student record, does have specific restrictions on the department's use of the data. And the restrictions, the department's ability to use the data does not include sharing parts of the student record with other government departments that aren't involved in either the administration of financial aid or the auditing or compliance related aspects of financial aid. So theoretically, and I do want to acknowledge this is a theoretical issue, FERPA pretty clearly reduces the risk that someone who's participating in the process of trying to help a relative, usually a child, sometimes a spouse, secure federal financial aid, might increase their risk of being identified as an undocumented person or called attention to. FERPA should be adequate to kind of prevent any increased possibility of risk to that undocumented person. Now, having said that, FERPA is just the law. And that means that we would expect our government to obey the law. And it also means that the government doesn't change the law. And so we really can't not acknowledge that given the upcoming change in the administration and some of the positions that the administration has taken, that people might be concerned. And we certainly would never say there's zero risk because, again, there's a compliance issue. Just because the law exists doesn't mean people might try to circumvent it. And also, we might see the law change. And Myra, did you want to comment? Because your hand is up.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. From a financial aid processing perspective, the question with blended families, that's challenging because you could be talking about like who the parent is and who needs to be added to the FAFSA, right? So you might have a divorced parent who's remarried. And I don't know if I'm touching on what the question is as far as that's concerned. So if you want to add more detail about that, I think we can get to what you're trying to get answered. In relation to undocumented students, so from a federal perspective, undocumented students are not eligible for federal financial aid. I do see that you have and state aid. I am from Virginia. I did not properly introduce myself. My name is Myra Vasquez. I a colleague of Robert's. He invited me on from a financial aid perspective. In Virginia, we do have a program where undocumented students are eligible for state aid and in-state tuition under certain rules. And I don't know if New York has a similar program. Okay, thank you, Kim. So it might be that you all already have a similar program where students are undocumented students, even though they're not eligible for federal aid, there is an application that they go through for that state aid. Thank you. So I won't speak to that because that's not my wheelhouse, but I did want to say that some states, not all states, do have undocumented, may have aid for undocumented students, but keep in mind that typically if a student's going out of state, typically the student has to be considered an in-state student. And I don't know if that's true for New York, but that's true for Virginia. So if a student comes here, they won't be eligible for state aid because they're not, if an undocumented student were to come to Virginia to go to college, they wouldn't be eligible for our state aid because they're not considered, you know, a domiciled in Virginia. So that's important to mention. As far as the blended family, I do think it's a difficult conversation. Parents get very confused about who needs to be on the FAFSA. It's always going to be the biological parent. It's always going to be the biological parent, biological parents, or if it's a biological parent who is remarried, it will be the step parent and the biological parent. And that biological parent is the parent who provided the most financial support in the last year. Am I right, Robert?
Yes,
Okay.
except that biological or adopted parents.
Oh, thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for adding that. Yes, and typically adoptive as well. So I just wanted to throw some context into that from a financial aid processing. So if you have any more question on that, please feel free to add to that. And then there is just another jump in here on undocumented parents with documented students. They are eligible. Their parents just have to do the FAFSA without a social security number. Please feel free to jump in.
And then I just, yeah, so and then this is a longer conversation and we'll be holding more webinars on this because it's top of mind for every counselor in America right now. But I just want to sort of emphasize what I'm hearing from both of you is the verification process, and we'll continue on with this set of slides, but can be a scary process for families because it feels like they're questioning the family about their identity and they're questioning the family about their income. But the important takeaway here is this is actually quite routine and required. It's a lot of this is the education department simply spitting out an audit number that you got to do it. So I just want the audience to understand that just in 99% of the time, just answer the questions, get it done, and know that it's routine and not like a personal attack on the kids and the family. Just getting us back to the verification idea. So,
and it can be random.
It can be random. It's like a big chunk of it is random.
It was completely random in 24, 25. We don't know yet if it's going to be random in 25, 26. But yeah.
Walter's got his hand up too.
I was going to ask Walter, you had your hand up, went up, and now it's down. Did you want to add something?
Hi, Robert. Yes, no, I wanted to add that, yes, for New York, we do have the Senator Jose Peralta pretty much, and that will be with the DREAM Act for students applying for state aid for students in New York. However, they will still need to reside within, New York State. Yes, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so thanks, Kim, for that. And we'll probably pick up on more on this at the other end as well, because there's a couple of more things to add to the conversation there. Let's just kind of come back and just some more facts. So in 24, 25, the first year we were doing FAFSA simplification, I think as kind of a solve to the higher education community that was facing a lot of challenges, just as applicants did with the late release of the FAFSA, the rocky rollout of the FAFSA, and all the changes. The department announced that actual verification, the one where the department informs the students that they need to take actions and the school that they need to check data, was going to be very limited. And in fact, I have I have talked to schools that have 10,000 students that had fewer than 100 students selected for verification. So the department had kind of said to the schools, we're not going to give you what we call a high verification burden because we know that there's a lot going on. We can't go to zero, but we won't select a lot of people. And most of the selected students were selected for the verification of identity. We don't know yet what 25, 26 is going to bring. Department hasn't told us if they're going to keep verification very modest or if they're going to go up to a larger percent. Historically, it was 28%, no, 33%, and then it dropped to 28, and eventually they dropped it down to between 10 and 20% because the department uses models, and as their models get better, they don't have to select as many people to test the data that they're concerned about. But the schools were kind of surprised as 24, 25 rolled out because the department began to identify things that the schools needed to do that created a verification level of work for the schools outside of verification. So in a sense, the department was creating conflicting information, turning conflicting information into a verification level process. And so even though schools were not seeing many students who were selected, they were getting these other codes that were telling the schools, you have to go and check this, and you have to go and check this. And so the burden on schools began to grow and grow and grow. So you may have and will probably continue to see students who are being asked to provide tax returns even outside of having been selected for verification, or students or their contributors. And some of the reasons are, I don't know if those of you who might be interested in taxes, as interested in taxes as I am are, but there's a question on the FAFSA that is a trap. And that question is, when someone is asked, did you file a tax return? A 1040, if they say no, they have to tell the Department of Education why on the FAFSA. And one of the questions is, I did not file a tax return for reasons other than low income. You know, we can translate that into, I didn't file a tax return in spite of having a lot of income. And anyone who answers that question will get an email or a letter from the school asking them to explain, how do you have high income and you're not filing a tax return? The department has defined that as conflicting information. So that's not verification, but it does trigger the same kind of communication with the student, the same kind of documentation requirements that verification would have. There was also a change that we're going to talk about in a couple of minutes to some of the FAFSA data. And this change actually happened in April of 2024, long after the FAFSA had been live. That changed the definition of two data elements, one of which was the income tax paid. And there's always been a what we call a reject on the FAFSA. And it's a reject because the data can't be, it's almost certain there's a mistake in the data. So the ISER is flagged as a reject. And what reject means is the school can't award federal money until they figure out what the reject is about. And one of the rejects, which is quite logical in the old days, was that the income tax reported was 40% or greater than the adjusted gross income. And in the old days, usually that meant the tax return was filed incorrectly. Well, the department kind of rolled this forward as a check, but then the definition of tax changed, and all of a sudden there's a lot more of these because the definition of the change in the tax was not related to AGI at all. So schools have been having to deal with this more directly. And then this is an interesting one. A blank and a zero are not the same on the FAFSA. And there are any FAFSA that comes in with what the department calls missing important or missing critical data will have a reject code on it. And again, reject code doesn't mean the student's not eligible for aid. Reject code means that the school has to figure out what those answers are before they can provide an estimate or a statement of financial aid. And one of the problems in the new FAFSA, and it's probably not something that US-based assistants, helpers are going to see, but the FAFSA, the Department of Education treats people who don't live in the United States and had foreign income but didn't file a tax return, or said that they didn't have any earned income and live outside of the United States. They actually treat those people as tax filers. And so you could be, you may have someone that has a parent who lives outside of the United States and isn't required to file a tax return in that country, who says, I had foreign income, but I didn't have to report it on a tax return. Even though they said they didn't file a tax return, they are treated as though they filed a tax return and have to fill in all the tax data. And if they skip them because, I don't know what an IRA deduction is, or I don't know what an IGI is, that ICER will be blank, and the student will be told on the ICER that important tax information was left off your application. So the student is thinking, my parents didn't file a tax return. Why are they saying important tax information was left off my application? It doesn't exist. And so these are the kinds of additional things that trigger the school to reach out to the student or the student's contributors and ask for additional information. Last thing here, and then we're going to move on to a slightly different topic, is, and Myra and Walter, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that, my understanding is if an applicant's parents apply for a PLUS loan, there may be an identity verification of the borrower and or the student that comes in not through verification, but through a kind of a list. Is that accurate to say? Yeah, so go ahead, Maya, if you don't mind.
I was just gonna say, yes, there are these files that the feds have been sending to colleges, where we have to review those students for verification. Just to be technical, it's fresh on the mind because I've just been having a conversation today about this. They're called AHSI files that the college gets. And those files have, so the student's ICER, which is what the college gets, may not show that that student needs to have that verification, but we may get that name on a file. And what can be frustrating about that is that we may have processed that student's record and then learn that we have to now go back to that student. Please don't get mad at us. But we have to now comply with the regulation to go get identity verification. And I think what's happening, I think, is that the government is just really trying to fine tune their fraudulent activity, and just recognizing and acknowledging that it's out there, and they may just be behind on finding those indicators is all I can think of why we might get something later in the file.
Yeah, thank you, Myra, for that. And yes, I will agree that the it's significantly higher in colleges. And I recall when I was at the college, sometimes the students do qualify for the full financial aid, and it's still the parents is the one who would like the loan, So it's something to think about, and maybe that may be one of the reasons why, the numbers are really high for parents applying for this type of loans, although the students do qualify for financial aid and they don't actually really need the money for educational purposes. So that's something to keep in mind.
And we have a
to-
question, Robert, also, like, how would this look like on the student side, right? So like the colleges are getting these requests to verify students. How are those requests handled? Like what comes to the student?
Well, I'm going to pass it back to our financial aid officers for that, because they're the ones that are doing it. So if Walter and Myra, if you wouldn't mind taking that question, that would be great. So what is the student, how are you communicating the request to the student, and what is the student's experience when they're either selected for V4 or they're on the list that requires similar action?
Walter, you want to go ahead?
Oh, sure, I can try. So for CUNY purposes, right? So we have 25 campuses, and pretty much if the student is selected for any type of verification, pretty much it will show up in their account. We use CUNY First, and that's PeopleSoft. And pretty much the student will have a notification in there, and once they have the notification, they will be able to get in and pretty much submit any paperwork that is missing, or just refer to the financial aid office for them to finalize the process in there. Myra?
Yeah, it's similar. I mean, the key thing to know is your students, when you're working with them, is please let them know that they must know how the college communicates with them. It might come in an email, it might be something that they need to sign into their system. For us, we use a message center tool in our system, but it sends an email telling the student they have to check the message center or check the to-do list. So it'll come in different ways, but definitely there should be a communication coming to the student in the way that that school communicates with the student.
Yeah, and the other thing I'm sort of hearing behind what you said, and I just wanted to emphasize, is we're talking here about last year's FAFSA information. So what I hear is that students are still being verified from the information they put in last year's FAFSA. And I just wanted to elevate that, emphasize that for folks on this call, because if you're working with students that are in college, if you're like a success counselor, or you're at a college in another capacity that's not financial aid, this is something to continue to follow up on. It's not something that we left behind in the, last summer or in the spring. It's a thing that's still going on, this kind of verification. So I just wanted to make sure that you guys got that.
Yeah, and I want to amplify that, Sandy, because really it is very important for students to be checking those communication tools probably weekly or bi-weekly, even while they're attending school. Because something could pop up in the middle of the year that they may not have anticipated.
And something also to add on it is like when you're applying for financial aid, in this case FAFSA, make sure you're using your personal email address instead of the high school, because once you transfer from high school to college, you start using your personal email address, and then you are like, oops, I was using the one from high school and I don't longer have access to that. So then it becomes an issue when trying to fix the FSA ID in that matter for the communication purposes,
Yeah. We have one more question, if it's okay, Robert.
Of course.
On this, related to this topic. Mariposa says, any suggestions for those parents who worked under the table and are undocumented? If it's not the proper, like, is it the right thing to do to say did not file FAFSA for reasons other than low income? Or like, I don't know, any tidbits on that?
I'm just closing my ears and my eyes right now.
This is what I do. This is what I
Off the
do a lot
record,
of.
right?
I talk about those
That's good
questions a
here.
lot. Yeah. So, all right. So if someone, I mean, let's take someone living in the United States, take people outside the United States out of the picture, because that just adds a lot of complexity that really isn't going to be relevant to most of us. So if someone does not file a tax return, now the department, the FAFSA doesn't ask, were you required to file a tax return and chose not to? It doesn't ask that. The question is very straightforward. I think I may, here you go. Look at that. I even anticipated that question. And before I do this, I just wanted to check with Walter and Myra again, because on the list of students whose identity needs to be verified, is it only the student you need to check, or is it ever the borrower you need to check?
My experience has only been the student.
Okay, I just want to confirm that. I want people to know that, we're focused on the student in this case. So there's no difference between the student who was selected for V4, which is the identity verification. I use V4 as our vernacular. V4 would be the identity verification, and the student who's being asked to verify because they're an action like borrowing a parent loan kicked in. The student is the person whose identity is at question. The student is Title 48 eligible, which means they are not undocumented, and therefore that shouldn't trigger any extra concerns for undocumented parents about their additional risk they might be assuming by participating in this process. So getting to that question, thank you. So the FAFSA starts out by asking each person, did or will you file a Form 1040 or 1040 NR? These are the kind of our fundamental tax returns. If they answer no, then they need to answer one of these 6 questions in order to proceed through the application. Now, the first 3 are for people who don't live in the continental United States. The first is, I didn't file a US 1040 because I live in a territory and filed a territory return, or I filed a foreign tax return. And then there's the one that says they earned income in a foreign country, but did not and will not file any tax return. But the three on the right are the ones we'd expect most people who are US based. The first one, the parent, even though they earned income in the United States and did not and will not file a US tax return because their income was below the threshold. So no trap there. The US has certain thresholds for filing a tax return, and they're just saying, I didn't earn enough to have to file. The second is the trap. I think I even have a red flag there. The parent did not and will not file a US tax return for reasons of low income. This is the one that forces the institutions to ask them, why didn't you file a tax return if you didn't have low income? And the last one is the parent did and will not file any tax return because they did not earn any income. And so in a situation where a parent is receiving cash payments outside of the formal employer-employee relationship, which triggers a W-2, or outside of being self-employed with the intention of paying taxes, and so they get cash payments. There's no way to track them. Now, technically, if that value is less than the amount that would trigger a requirement to file a tax return, they would choose the first bullet. So for an unmarried person in 2023, I'm sorry, I've moved on to 2023 in my thinking. So for the sake of the argument, in 2023, a single person would have to file a tax return if they earned $13,850 or more. And a married couple, if between them they earn $27,700 or more, they'd have to file a tax return. So if those cash payments, those under the table payments, were less than $13,850 for a single person, or $27,700, I don't know the numbers perfectly, but something on those order line. If they choose the first button, that's fine. You don't have to file a tax return if your income is below the threshold. And unless the student were selected for V1 verification or the income verification, the school would have no reason to challenge that. And so if someone has small amount of cash-based income coming in, that's the right answer. Now, I'm never going to say someone should answer a question fraudulently or not honestly. So if someone brought in, say, $40,000 of cash payments, then the correct answer would be the one that I flagged here, which I'm acknowledging would trigger the school to go back to them and ask what's going on. And so I'm certainly not going to advise people to put a false answer on the application, but people who don't bring in enough money to reach those thresholds should feel perfectly fine saying I didn't file a tax return for reasons of having income below the threshold, and feel pretty confident that that means there's nothing they're going to come back to them. Now, if the student is selected for income verification, the parent will be asked to itemize their earned income, other income, and sources of support. That's the document that the school will ask for. And if they were to report that they earned $40,000, the school would have to go back to them and say, we can't process the application without a tax return. And they would have to give the person the option of either filing a tax return or going without Title IV aid. So that's the purpose of the verification, of flagging this question, and also of selecting some people randomly for V1 just to test, are there people who are saying their income was below the threshold even though their income was above the threshold. So there is a risk, remember, we don't have under the table income here. If you work and you receive income, it's taxable income. And so there's a risk if you are receiving income and not properly accounting for it in the tax system, that could jeopardize financial aid eligibility for yourself or a family member if it rises to the level that it appears on the FAFSA and the school is asked to detect it and does detect it and identifies that we can't process the application without the tax return. I hope that was helpful, and I know I kind of got a little circuitous there. So if there's any follow-up questions, feel free. to ask them. And I have to tell you, I'm very proud of my red flag graphic there. I worked really hard on that. I had to kind of edit it so that it was, because it's this, you can only have squares, so I had to kind of position it perfectly so it didn't cover up that or
So,
there and
Robert,
stuff like that. Yes.
and first of all, the red flag looks amazing. Second of all, there is a question, and this gets into this idea of payments that parents may be getting from government sources and others, and how that kind of fits into the mix here. So there's just to verify, the red flagged question on your slide can refer to parents who receive VA disability payments. The mom has no additional income. I'm working with a student whose parents fit into this category, and I want to make sure I'm advising the student correctly.
Yeah.
But what about these government payments, and how do they come into the mix in terms of income?
Okay, so really, really good question. So the remember, we're focusing on whether someone had to file a tax return here. And so there's a lot of income, VA disability benefits are tax exempt, that would never trigger a tax return filing. So, if we're talking specifically about VA disability benefits, they are not taxable, so you don't have to file a tax return. And so you would not even include them in the income related to filing thresholds. Other things that would not play into account here would be if someone was living solely off of Social Security. Social Security is not taxed unless you have a fair amount of other kinds of taxable income. There are certain pension payments and private disability payments that may be tax exempt. And so what we're really, the government is most concerned about here is earned income, because earned income is almost always taxable. And other kinds of taxable income, like rental income or investment income or things like that. And people generally know if the income they're earning should be filed on a tax return or not. And so I think most people who are receiving benefits have a general sense about if they're taxable or not. But in this particular case, we are only interested in the taxable income that the person might be bringing in that didn't trigger a tax return filing. And again, a lot of what I do is I explain to financial aid officers about what's taxable and not taxable. And so, people who don't have access to me may not understand that. But generally, with disability benefits, it's reasonably correct to say that government-based disability benefits, especially VA benefits, are tax exempt. Disability benefits related to public service jobs like police officers, firefighters, EMTs, tax exempt. The only taxable disability payments are Social Security for people who have a lot of other kinds of income can be taxable, and then private disability plans that were employer sponsored. But if you were counseling someone and they said, all of my income is disability, I'm living off of disability, you are not a tax expert. The likelihood is that that income is tax exempt. And so you would not worry about how that would impact these answers. Any other related questions there?
Yeah, I think that's good. That's great.
Okay,
So-
great. Okay, here are some other conflicting information issues that your students and contributors may be addressing. You've all dealt with head of household, or we've all dealt as financial aid administrators with head of household, but the schools really do need to kind of evaluate the relationship in the FAFSA between the tax returns that were filed and what the filing status was, and the marital status of the parent when it hits the application. And one of the big issues is a lot of people will use the head of household filing status while married, who aren't eligible to do that. So it should not be too uncommon if a student came in and you were working on filling out the application with them, and the parents said, we're married, and then you're looking at the tax return and one of them is filed as a head of household and the other hasn't filed. A lot of times that's going to trigger a request from the college for an explanation about why the parent used the head of household filing status. And the problem here is that the two reasons why people who are married can use the head of household filing status do not include one of the parents is an undocumented person. Um, a married person can use that of household filing status if they're married to a non-resident non-citizen. In other words, if the person that they're married to does not live in the United States and is not a US citizen, but our undocumented family members are usually living in the United States, so they're not non-resident. And then the second is the married couple are living apart for reasons that won't end. In other words, they're separated physically for non-temporary reasons, and that usually means that their marriage is they don't have a functional marriage and are effectively living as as though they're independent, as though they're unmarried. And in that particular case, the question, they probably should have said they were separated on the FAFSA, because on the FAFSA marital status definition includes separated, which says if you and your spouse have lived apart, are living apart as though you're unmarried, don't say you're married, just say you're separated, and then only one person has to file. But that one, marital status and filing status mismatches, I think is the one that can create the most likely barrier to the student ultimately receiving federal financial aid, because it can't be resolved without an amended tax return that might include a joint tax return that includes the spouse's information on it, or the head of household might have to file change it to married filing separately, and there might be a filing requirement on the undocumented person as well. So that's one. There's no real out there. That's one. It's a bit of a barrier that there really is no surmounting. If people are especially concerned about not putting the undocumented parent information on a federal tax form, that may not be one that can be resolved. Already talked about income tax paid greater than 40% of AGI. I'm going to come back to that. And the critical important tax question was left off. Here are some surprises. Okay, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Robert. Just before we move forward, and I think we could do an entire webinar on head of
Yes.
household.
And I do.
We should, yes. Everybody should tune in to Robert's NICEFA webinars on this stuff. So Vanessa had a quick question at the whole temporal distortion aspect of the FAFSA. So, and her question was, what about a parent that remarried later in the tax year, or like if there is I guess the question is also is if you are one status in 2023 taxes, which is what we're going to get, and then all of a sudden you're changing statuses, does that, I can't remember if the FAFSA kind of captures that in some way, or you're going to have to send a note to the financial aid officer.
You know, you are, that's very astute. You are raising an issue that is particularly complicated this year. So when the school thinks there might be something wrong in the application, when they identify conflicting information, the presumption is the information is incorrect, but they can accept as a way of resolving their concern a reasonable explanation about why the information is in fact correct. And you have, was it Vanessa, was it? Kind of raises a really good point. The filing status is based on the last day of the tax year. And so for 24-25, that would have been 2022. So, you know, your filing status is based on December 31st, 2022, but the FAFSA in the best of times can't be filed until October 1st, 2023, or, you know, 9 months later. And so one of the reasonable explanations that can come in is that I was married on the last day of 2022, but I got divorced in April, or I threw them out in May because I just couldn't take it anymore, or they passed away. And so the school will get a reasonable explanation and move forward. with it. And we used to have a question, this ended in 23, 24, but we used to have a marital status date. And so if we knew that the tax return was one thing, but the marital status date was after the last day of the tax year, we never had to worry about it, because you could have been married on the last day of the tax year and filed a joint tax return, and now you're separated and you have a marital status date after the last day of the tax year. Okay, so you got separated on that date and everything is perfectly fine. Go ahead, Walter. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Robert. Yes, and just to add on it, once you verify that information, you will have documentation that proves that pretty much your parents are living separated, as well as a new correction to the taxes if it is needed as well in some instances. Just to add on that.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you, Walter. That's important, because the school may ask you for documentation, the explanation. But we do have this period of time between the last day of the tax year and the day the FAFSA is filed that may solve the problem. But now that the schools don't have the date in the application, they may have to ask more questions. Now, the other kind of situation that can happen is, it gets very complicated, but you could have people that were married on the last day of the tax year. Maybe they get divorced in March, and then one of them gets remarried. And so you have a joint tax return for 2022, but different people need to be on the FAFSA. And those things can kind of show up in situations where maybe the IRS was able to put the joint tax return into the FAFSA because there was a married couple and they filed a joint tax return. But then you start looking at it and you realize, wait a minute, the married tax return, the joint tax return I'm looking at isn't matching the data that I have here, because they're, and so you discover that one of the people was in a different marriage in 2022 than they are in 2023 or 2024. And you can encourage your students and their parents to be proactive about this, because you might be in the position of trying to tease out which parent, and is there now a step parent, is required to provide information on the application. And if it takes time to tease that out for you, it might be useful to invite the student to kind of put something together that explains it to the school, so that the school has that information up front and doesn't start from scratch again, trying to figure out how to reconcile the data that they're seeing.
Super helpful. And then, yeah, just always emphasizing that if there's anything, if your students are have anything that's different over the last, since the tax filing year, it is helpful just to send a quick note to the financial aid offices, if you just so that everything can keep moving smoothly.
Yeah. Thank you, Kim. All right, so let's look at some surprises that happened after our December webinar last year. And I think the biggest of the surprises, and ironically, the department chose to announce this on April Fool's Day in 2024, was that after processing 8 million FAFSAs, the department announced that they were getting a different set of data from the IRS for two questions, taxes paid and education credits, than they thought. And so they were changing the definition of income taxes paid and education credits retroactively. And so, so what we had was, everybody was thinking, this is a little technical and you don't really need to kind of remember this now that we're out of the past, but everyone was thinking that we were going to get, for income taxes paid, Form 1040 line 22 minus Schedule 2 line 2 of the tax returns, including the Department of Ed. They were expecting this too. And they were expecting the education credits was going to be Schedule 3 line 3. But when they started looking at the data, for some reason, they didn't start looking at the data till April. I think the reason might have been that schools started looking at the data when they began to get their ISER version of the FAFSA and noticed that the data weren't matching what they were expecting. So the department decided, gee, maybe we better take a look at what the IRS is sending us. And lo and behold, it was different. And having processed 8 million applications with the old data, remember, we had no manual processed FAFSAs at that point. We only had the IRS data. the electronic data coming in from the IRS, they said, we're just going to keep the new lines, which is Form 1040, line 24, and Form 8863, line 8, plus Form 8863, line 19. Now, I want to highlight this because I think you, as college access professionals, really need to know that for 2024, this creates a big inequity problem. So here's the situation. If if a contributor's information was brought in from the IRS, then the IRS was setting in one set of data. But if someone was asked to provide manual data, the instructions in the PDF FAFSA, if they filled it out on paper, or if they looked online and looked at what lines they were supposed to use, were the old values. So people who have their data populated by the IRS had one set of data coming in, and people who were asked to manually provide data were providing a different kind of data. And in every case, the value from the IRS would be equal to or greater than the value that the manual instructions told people to do. And since we're talking about, this is again, kind of really in the weeds, but the way the financial aid formula works is we subtract the taxes paid and the education credits out of the income before we calculate the student's eligibility for Title IV aid, for financial aid. And so the larger the income tax or the education credits are, the smaller the student aid index is. And since the IRS values could be larger than the manual values, there are probably hundreds of thousands of students whose parents provided manual data who are getting less financial aid than their counterparts whose parents were able to get the FADDX, the IRS match, to work. And what does that mean? Who are our parents who were not able to get the IRS match to work? Parents without social security numbers. So one of the things that I've been advising schools to do is I've been advising schools to look for situations when they have manually entered data where they might be able to predict that the answers to income taxes paid and education credits was smaller than it could be, and be proactive about going out to schools and ask to students and saying, if we had a look at your parents' tax return, we might be able to give you a little bit more aid. But from turning it around from your perspectives as you're working with students, and remember, this is not going to be an issue in 25-26 because the department is updating things for 2025-26. We're still going to be using the new tax lines, but we'll be consistent between the people who fill it out manually and the people who don't. But in 24-25, if you have access to someone's tax return, and for example, you notice that the parent had a lot of Schedule C income, that's one of the reasons the taxes might be different. You might say to them, why don't you send your tax return to the school just voluntarily, and ask them to take a look at the tax, because they might be able to make the adjustment that way. And similarly for the education credits, if the education credit on Schedule 3, line 3 were 1,500, and that's the most common value, then if they had been able to use the FADDX, it would have been 2,500. And that would increase the amount of education credits that are subtracted. But it really frustrates me that the department kind of left this inequity out there. From this perspective of the schools, the department says you don't have to address this. It's completely discretionary. But in 24-25, if we were to do some studies, we would probably determine a measurable a measurable difference between economically equivalently students whose parents had social security numbers versus parents who didn't, in terms of the outcome of the student aid formula, because of this mistake that wasn't detected until 4 months after the process got turned on. And again, I have to point out that initially I thought this was some sort of really badly implemented April Fool's joke by the department, because I could not believe that this mistake happened. A couple of other things. The department, I think, was a little bit surprised that even if the IRS provided data into the application, people could go in and overwrite that data by entering manual data in what that process I called earlier was a correction. And one of the big issues was a lot of people, enough people manually said that they didn't file a tax return. And then the IRS match brought tax data in. And so we have a manually answered question. I didn't file a tax return. And then the IRS says, I don't care that you're telling me you didn't file a tax return. I got one. And here's the data that goes in. And that created a bit of a problem for the schools because once someone says they didn't file a tax return, their student aid index was set to the lowest possible value, which was minus 1,500. And they were given the maximum amount of Pell Grant that was available, which was $7,395. But with the data from the tax return in the application, those answers might be incorrect. And so remember I mentioned earlier, we had federal tax information. Here's that word where the IRS puts the information in the application and it has to be handled really, really carefully. In that situation where the student said that they didn't file, the contributor said they didn't file a tax return, but the IRS put tax data in, you would think, well, just change did not file a tax return to did file a tax return. The IRS is telling you that. But because of the way the IRS code is, schools couldn't do that. They had to go and get a copy of the tax return from the contributors and manually enter the data in because the IRS data can't be used it can't be taken out of the IRS fields and put into the manual fields. The department has said that they're going to fix this for both for 24-25 and 25-26, but they said that about 4 months ago and we haven't heard anything on it. But that's just another thing to be aware of, that if people say they didn't file a tax return, the underlying this whole system is that they're going to check with the IRS anyway. And apparently a lot of people said they didn't file a tax return and the IRS gave tax data, and that created a lot of extra work for the school that again requires a request for information from the student or the student's parent to be able to fix the application.
Robert, this is like really huge. And I hadn't heard this before. So a couple things, I don't know if we know the answer to this. So a new feature in the 2025-26 FAFSA is that that it says your data has been uploaded successfully, right? It's giving
right, yes.
So I don't know if you know this, but where does it fall on the text? So if a parent, it happens right at the beginning, I think. So if a parent says, I didn't file a tax return, but then they get the dialogue window that says, oh, it was just uploaded successfully. Like, so do you know do you have any idea of how that flow works? And also we should be really aware of that issue for a lot of reasons, I guess. Are you a tax filer or not a tax filer? It's so funny that people don't know if they are tax filers. Like, think that they would remember signing their taxes.
The question is, did you file a 1040 or a 1040 NR?
Okay.
So they may not know that that was the form. And I've actually challenged the department on this. If you have older parents, there's another form, the 1040 SR for seniors. And so, yeah, well, the easy went away in 2018.
Okay,
But you know, it's very reasonable. Like if your parent is 65 and filed the 1040 SR, you didn't file a 1040 or 1040 NR. And so you have the same problem. Myra's got her hand up. I think she may know the answer. I was going to say, I don't know that the path, what the path is. Yeah.
Any advice?
I don't know that I have an answer to what you're saying, Kim, necessarily, but this is a huge issue. People have said no, and we get tax information, and it significantly changes their aid eligibility. And I don't know that people are understanding what Robert mentioned in that you may say no, but the FAFSA is still checking for with the IRS. You've given consent. So the key thing is at the very beginning, in my mind anyway, when you're going through a FAFSA with someone and they're giving consent, maybe when you're working with someone one-on-one, be very clear that they are now going to the IRS to check and see if you filed the FAFSA. Regardless of what your answer is, they're still checking. I don't even, I have a challenge in my brain understanding why they're even asking if you filed, if they're going to the IRS to get, and then they're creating this conflict that initially they gave us bad information on how to resolve. And then we had to backtrack and change the way we resolved it. So this has been just a terrible, terrible thing. But when I'm thinking, when you work with families, it's very, very important that they understand that that if they say no, and I will say there are some bad actors that say no because they want to look like they have aid eligibility. Because when we get those taxes, we're like, dang, you know, it's a real big change here from being a non-filer to, you know, making, you know, $80,000 a year. So, it just needs to be, it really, I mean, SAI, so when we get that FAFSA with the income, what happens is it looks like they've got a lot of income, but they might have a very low student aid index because they went with that, no, I didn't file. And when we go in and enter the data, that increases the SAI tremendously. There are valid reasons though, like someone could have been married filing joint and the spouse made all the income. And, you know, so there are valid reasons why someone might say, no, I didn't file because I didn't have income when I was married that 2 years ago, I'm not married today. You know, so we have seen valid reasons for why this conflict might exist, but we've also seen just not valid, you know, clearly this person did not think that the IRS was going to, you know, get the
But then
data
I
test.
guess for going forward, and I don't know if this is something we should be asking our beta testers or the folks at FSA at this very moment. It seems to me like it should do the handshake in no matter what in the FAFSA at the beginning, get that data up there, and so then the SAI would be correct. It shouldn't even allow people to put in manual data or, you know, like
If I could address that,
Yeah.
the FADDX, the IRS match is not always available. And so I think that there could be a data flow such that before the person is asked, did you file a 1040 or 1040 NR, the attempt to bring the data in matches. But remember, if the IRS can't, if the tool is down for maintenance or something along those lines, the contributor is still given the opportunity to complete the application manually. And so we really, you know, we as a kind of a community trying to help the students can make an assessment that we would rather the FAFSA say we can't check with the IRS right now. We'll email you when you can come back and try to complete your application. That would be the alternative to being asked the question in case the FADDX, the IRS match didn't work. And so I would expect, and I don't know how instantaneous it is. I know that I mean, it's fast, but I don't know if it's, you know, happens within a minute. And so that in order to keep people going through the application while that minute is happening, they ask the question so they're geared up if the data doesn't come in to ask manual information, or if it's literally instantaneous such that this tool could be written in a way that after consent happens, they test it, and if they get the data, they're not asked the additional question, versus if it doesn't work, then they're asked the question. I don't know what the flow
there's
is.
a lot that changes. I mean, this is such, anyways, we can move on, but I would just say that the form is designed that way so that if the data is there and has been uploaded, then you're not going to be asked a bunch of questions that otherwise the manual filers, the manual folks filling it out manually will be asked. So they, you know, and it should include, did you file your taxes, as one of the questions that they don't answer because, you know.
We have about 10 more minutes, guys, just
Okay, sorry. Okay, we'll be quiet.
I do want to add that I don't think the department built in as much skip logic as you're referring to, Kim, as they have in the past. And we may say better experience this year, but I think they kind of ran out of time to do everything. And the last thing I'll say there is it is possible, and I'll look at this and I'll shoot you a note, Kim and Sandy, if you want to share it with participants, but it is possible that the Future Act was written in such a way that the department is required to ask that question, because the Future Act is not a perfect piece of legislation, and there are things that the department was required to do and told that they couldn't do that aren't sensible, and this might be one of them. But let's get through the last little bit, and then we'll take additional questions toward the end. We've got a few more slides to go. I just want to mention that you may have seen some of your applicants, some of your students receive multiple confirmations from the department called the FAFSA submission summaries. And that's because as processing happened, the department noticed that there were a number of processing errors. And as they noticed those errors, they would reprocess the applications, and they would anytime they reprocess them, that triggers another FAFSA submission summary, and the school gets an ICER. We shouldn't see as many of these this year, but there were things like change the way the department's handling amended tax returns. There are a whole bunch of applications that either included assets in the calculations when they were supposed to, or didn't include assets when they were required to. Some calculation errors. So if you saw that happening, that was just kind of the department over and over and over again sending the same application information through the system to correct prior incorrect calculations. We also had a problem with a lot of people reporting very, very large taxable scholarships on the application that they didn't have. Scholarships are only taxable if they're not used to pay tuition, required fees, and course-related materials. But if you read the question here, amount of college grant scholarships or AmeriCorps benefits reported as income to the IRS. I think that a lot of people took their 1098-T forms, the form on which the school reports to the IRS the student how much scholarship they received. I think they reported that there because that was reported to the IRS on a 1098-T, but that wasn't taxable scholarship. So if you're working with a student, you get to the taxable scholarship question, just remember, if you've got an incoming student, if your applicant is still in high school, the answer to this should be 0 because they didn't have any college grants or scholarships. But a lot of students and a lot of parents reported values here that the schools have had to reconcile and resolve. Fun fact, we were all really, really anxious about the number of college questions disappearing. There have been very, very few requests from students to have their sibling in college taken into account through the appeal process or professional judgment. Walter and Myra, I mean, let me know if I'm telling something that's not true, but I have stood before groups of 200 financial aid administrators and asked how many of you have had any requests for additional aid for your students based on their having a sibling in college. And I can have a room of 208 officers and have 0 people tell me that they received. So we were very worried about this question, and it has had nearly no impact on at least the behavior of students in terms of asking for more money, which I think is nice. I mean, it's good. I mean, the formula was more generous anyway, and the new generosity in the formula may have washed out the concern that we had about this. Just a quick update. So we have a couple of question opportunities to take some questions that might have popped in. Verification is fundamentally unchanged from 2024, 2025 to 25, 26. So if the student is selected for verification, we should see very similar requests. There are minor changes that a financial aid officer needs to know about, and I've listed them here, but we don't have to go into. But the department has not given us any sense about whether we're going to have more verification this year. So we're still waiting on something like that. And we should, but we should experience on a student by student level verification, and the pseudo verifications I mentioned earlier should be pretty consistent. The last thing I think, this might be the last thing I wanted to add, is I do want to let you know that unfortunately, the department has said that the requirement that a contributor without a social security number The student has to provide exactly to the character the same name, date of birth, and street address of the contributor, or the invitation can't be accepted, is going to be rolled forward into 25-26. The solution will not be implemented initially in 25-26. So if you have had students whose contributors couldn't match because of the an extra character being in the address field, or avenue versus ave being entered, the department is reporting that they are working on fuzzy matching, which is a way of kind of asserting that data that looks very similar is accurate. But one problem that we're going to be seeing again in 25-26 is that these matches are going to be very difficult again. And I just wanted to let you know that. I've published, I've cut out of the document that I found this, so you have the specific wording that the department had. If you want to see the webinar in which the department discussed this or read the transcript, you can go to fsatraining.ed.gov and look for the November 8th training. This is a password protected website, but it is open to the public. So if you're interested in having access to department training directly, just go to fsatraining.ed.gov, create an account. It's not an account related to a financial aid officer having access to systems. It's an account anyone can get. And once you have that account, you'll have access to the same training that financial aid administrators have access to through the Department of Education. So, and if you want to see this specifically, you can find it by following the instructions there. And the very last thing I'm going to tell you is there is a change to the student aid index formula in 25-26 compared to 24-25. And that simply is that part of the SAI formula is how much of the student's income contributes to the SAI. The most important thing for you to know is that if a student was not awarded the maximum amount of Pell Grant, which was $73.95, if they got Pell Grant, but it was less than that, then it is very possible their Pell Grant will be dropped about $1,500 in 25-26 if everything else was unchanged. This should not affect a lot of people, but schools have to gear up for it. And I just wanted to let you know that that was another issue. I want to take the remaining time for questions. So please keep my email handy. If you want to talk more about any of this, you have any questions that we don't get to today, feel free to email me. Let me know you participated in this discussion, and I'll try to answer your questions there. But Sandy and Kim, do we
Yes.
have any questions that we can
Yes,
take
we
quickly?
have Vanessa with her hand raised. As Vanessa asks her question, I'm also going to pop up a poll with some evaluation questions. Please do complete that and listen at the same time. Go ahead, Vanessa.
Good morning. This was a phenomenal session. Thank you so much. So I have two really quick questions based on two recent scenarios that I'm working with two students on. One student is living here in New York with family members. Their parents live in another country. There's no legal guardianship in place. So technically, that student would have to provide their parental information. The
Yes.
parents complete no U.S. Tax return. How would that be handled? And the second question is, I have a family. Mom got married in November. The tax year, for the tax year, she filed head of household because she was single. She was the head of household. But
Yeah.
at the date of the FAFSA completion, or she's about to complete the FAFSA, I should say, she will be married. So
Yeah.
she would have to. So the tax return is going to say head of household. It indicates that she's married. So yeah, the easy fix that, when the school contacts her, she will provide the updated information. But here's the conundrum. At the time of the step parent for the tax year, 23, the step parent was married to someone else and filed a joint tax return?
One of those situations. All right. So first, thank you for those great questions. The student with the parents who live outside the United States, if they filed a tax return to the country in which they live, then they would simply say, I didn't file a 1040. I did file a foreign tax return. And then they'll be presented with the income questions, and they really just need to squeeze their answers into those. They would provide that information. If they didn't file a tax return, they will either say, I didn't file a tax return and I had foreign income, or I didn't file any tax return and I had no earned income. And each of those will trigger a request from the school for additional information. But they should just fill out the application, to the best of their ability. The school will reach out and may ask them for additional information later on, and the school will provide a better explanation for them. For the second situation, because the couple is now married, the parent and the step parent have to provide information. The parent, because they filed as head of household, that data may be able to come in through the application through the IRS, in which case they'll have that very smooth and efficient application, and they should not answer they didn't file a tax return, so they don't get into that problem, or they will be asked to manually enter their data. For the second parent, the step parent, they would be the parent, spouse, or partner in the application. It is possible that the IRS would bring in the joint tax return, but only the step parent, not the step parent's ex, would be required to provide information. So that step parent should manually go into the application. If the application doesn't present them with the opportunity to manually enter data, they should go into the application once the FAFSA submission summary comes back, and just manually enter their data, their AGI, their portion, their share of each of the items, and make sure that their information is so from the step parent's perspective, they will get a invitation, they'll accept the invitation, they'll provide IRS consent to match with the IRS. If the tool pops up and said, we've brought your data into the application, they should take that as a red flag that data may include their ex-spouse's information. If the tool gives them the opportunity to manually enter their own data, then they will be fine. If the tool doesn't give them that opportunity and they submit it, then when the student gets the FAFSA submission summary, they should go in and say they want to make a correction. At that point, they'll be given the income section, and they should go line by line through the joint tax return and answer the questions as for them. So the AGI was 110,000, but their AGI would have been 60 without the X. They put 60,000 in. So it's a little bit complicated, but that should be the kind of process that they would experience.
And Robert, can I ask one super quick question? I'm hoping you can answer it quickly.
Yep.
Everybody wonders what happens with amended tax returns. So do those automatically get pushed into the ICER? How does that work?
Yeah. Oh, that's not a quick question. All
Okay,
right. So the Department of Education thought it was going to get amended tax return data from the IRS, and realized again on that kind of April timetable that they wouldn't. So quickest I can say is for both 24-25 and 25-26, the IRS is going to provide amended original data, even if there's an amended tax return. The schools are not required. Let's go. I mean, I don't think it was a very good policy, but let's take the policy of don't ask, don't tell here. If someone amends their tax return, the IRS is going to give the FAFSA the original tax return. If the contributor and student don't tell the school that there was an amended tax return, the school doesn't know, and therefore the original data will be used. If the student comes in and says, hey, my parents filed a tax return, what do I need to do? Then the school has to get the amended tax return and update the FAFSA for that purposes. So for at least for 24, 25, and 25, 26, the school is only responsible for dealing with an amended tax return if the student or contributor tell them they had amended tax return. We want to take that slightly further. If the amended tax return has less income on it, then tell the school and they will be able to correct the FAFSA and perhaps create more financial aid eligibility. If the amended tax return has more income on it, don't ask, don't tell, and keep the aid based on the original tax return. And the schools would love that because processing amended tax returns is challenging for the schools.
Okay, great to know. And then I guess the only reason is also if we feel like that there was something like the head of household was wrong and people go and do an amended return to make it right. I guess then the advice there is show the school your amended tax return is now correct, right?
Yeah. But even in that scenario, if the school says we can't process the application without you filing a amended return with a different filing status, they're going to be waiting for it.
Okay.
But if you detect it some other way and you don't tell the school and the tax return that's in there is better, I mean, technically you should tell them, but if they don't know, they're allowed to use the original data. So, I mean, I'm a little bit more accommodating with amended tax returns on people not sharing information that might be detrimental, only because the department kind of went through this really excruciatingly painful process of trying to figure out how to handle them and eventually kind of settled on, if you don't know about it, don't ask about it. And we're fine with that for the next couple of years. So let's take the department at their word. And, you know, if the student would get more eligibility for aid, if the school knew about the amended return, then selfishly let them know. And if it would be more costly and aid would be taken away, don't let them know, because effectively that's what the department has told the schools. If the school has, you know, some amended return and some other, the schools are allowed to use the lower value anyway. So why penalize students who are being honest and saying, hey, my parents amended their tax return, when if the IRS had provided some data in the past, they wouldn't have to take advantage of it. So
Thank
good
you
question.
so much. Thank you so much, Robert, for answering all of these very complicated questions. Thank you, Mayra. Thank you, Walter. Thank you, CACNY friends, for hosting us and for attending. Thank you to everyone. Kim, I don't know if I thanked you, but double thanks for elevating and for always being by my side in the FAFSA love. Anyway, thank you so much. I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. See you at our next meeting. Our next CAN meeting is going to be focused on preparing students for transfer. It's going to be different from this, but also very detailed and very expertly handled as well. Thanks again, Robert.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime. Bye, everybody. Thank you for
Okay.
having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Nice meeting you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm going to pop off too. Take
Thanks
care.
so much.
Unless you need me. Do you want to talk a little bit
No,
or?
thank you
Okay.
so much. Thank you. I'll email
Anytime.
you.
All right, great. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
I have to go
I'll
back to
send
my
all the
conference.
information.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex and Risa.
Hi. I'm gonna put everyone else in the waiting room because maybe they're just not here anymore.
I
That's-
can't get out. I can't figure out how to get
I'll
out.
end the meeting. I can do
Oh,
that.
I got
Sandy,
it.
do you want to talk about anything or are you good?
I'm good.
Bye.
Thank you so much, guys.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.